So I'd like to welcome all of you to AdedoyinSoyibo's paper called Africa and the Image of Evolutionary Self-Interest in Development. Professor Soyibo is a distinguished visiting professor and senior research associate here at the Department of African and African American Studies and the Center for African and African American Research. He is a professor of economics at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. He has a very distinguished career, some highlights of which I might just touch on. He's been teaching at the University of Ibadan. He received his PhD from the University of Ibadan in 1983. Before this, he has an SM in management from MIT, and he did his undergraduate work in mathematics, also at the University of Ibadan. He is active in a variety of ways, academically, as a consultant, and professionally. He served on a number of expert boards as a consultant. He is a member of several of the editorial board of several journals, including the Journal of Developing Areas and African Journal of Economic Policy. He has previously been a visiting scholar at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And the number of shorter programs that he's done in different parts of the world are really exhaustive. They go on for numbers of pages. He's well traveled. Any part of the world, I'm sure, that we would want to know about, he can tell us something about. And his list of publications is certainly into three digits. A long and distinguished career, and I wanted just to highlight the broad areas that his research focuses on without going into the details of all of the publications. His academic research is focused on quantitative techniques in economics and management and in health and population economics. So he's somebody who knows about the nuts and bolts of a lot of these issues, which many of us who are interested in Africa perhaps don't know as well. So with that, I'd like to welcome him, and I look forward to his paper here today.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. What I'm looking at is about the development of Africa, to answer questions that usually are not asked by others, because basically I'm an interested party. I'm an African. I'm looking at issues like what are those kind of policies that people would love to embrace, and why do people oppose some policies? Why would people want a particular policy, and why would they reject a particular policy? Because that's the heart of the problem and part of the things that affects African development. When you see people complaining about globalization, there is some image behind their mind about what they see as being against them. I try to explore this to try and explain what is happening in Africa. Besides that, what is unique about Africa? That those programs, those policies that work in other parts of the world do not work in Africa. I believe that explanations to these are in human nature and not in things that you can use deductive mathematical models to predict. And because of that, I'm looking at the history of development policy and African political history to find answers to these questions. I want to look at the concept of evolutionary self-interest by just tracing the history of development policy. Just yesterday, I heard this from President Obama. What sets us apart is not our power, but the purpose behind our actions. We who think we are the receiving end try to imagine something behind the purpose of the actions of powerful people. And it's not only Africa that has done that. That has always happened from time immemorial. From the age of enlightenment to the age of 20th century globalization, that has always happened. Let's take, for example, at the beginning of the age of enlightenment, we have the Italian city-states of Venice and Florence, and the Dutch nation that lack natural resources, but yet are doing well because of their manufacturing. They protect their industries, including patenting, which the Venetians discovered. This led to what the other European nations learned, starting with King Henry VII, with emulation technique, looking at what the other nations have done and protecting their industries, using what later got known as the mercantilist policies. And that is driven by economic nationalism. Each nation wanting to promote exports, but controlling imports, so that the nation can earn income at the expense of other nations. Each nation gained from this, and each of the nations protects its own self-interest. From this point of view, I see this as a self-interest that excludes others, but promotes each nation. But every nation got promoted by this. Then by 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, and he argued for the control of the economy using the invisible hand, talked against mercantilism. But interestingly, in his first treatise, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he also defended government intervention, the relationship between merchants and governments, saying, and I quote, that new manufacturers were not to help suppliers and consumers, but to help the great system of government. That was at the time Britain was not an industrial giant. At that material time, his views aligned with mercantilism. But at the time that Britain had become an industrial giant, he had a different view. And this Frederick Nietzsche looked at and called the cosmopolitical doctrine, seeking to kick away the ladder by which England attained the summit as industrial giant. By this view, England will be preventing other nations to attain the same summit that England attained. That is an image that excluded all, at least from the point of view of those who imagining what England was, the other continental European nation saw it, they smelt a rat, and they opposed it. More importantly, young America at that time opposed this seriously because, and partly what is happening now in this country, the image of small government got started from that era. Seeing government as extremely powerful, preventing, that is the colonial government, very powerful, preventing freedoms, not allowing the colonies to develop. America opposed that same concept. And there is a quotation from an American representative, House of Representative member in the 1820s, who said, "Do not do as the English said." No, it's general. It's not that quotation. This is a general consensus among Americans around that time. Do not do as the English said. Do as they did. Don't do as the English say. Do as they did. This is a matter of not precepts. I'm looking at what we are doing. If England protected its industries to develop, now England has become an industrial giant, others should not follow the same path that England developed. Now, interestingly, America, as the leader of the industrial and free world, now is doing exactly what the English are doing. Is the leader showing that poor nations, when they are developing, should not protect their industry based on the theory of comparative advantage of Ricardo. Within four centuries, we have seen interest about developing change. It has changed. In Britain, it changed. In America, it changed. It is evolving. Evolving is a type of change, not just growth. It can evolve in direction of inclusion. It can evolve in direction of exclusion. And that's why I use the term evolutionary self-interest. And it's the image that people have that make them embrace or not embrace a development policy. That image is what is I say drives development policy and hence drives development. It is that kind of image that leads to the globalization riots, SAP riots all over the world. And it's that kind of image that looks at development in its entirety, where we look at development as affecting development concerns. And development concerns are issues of development like governance, income distribution, poverty, governance at different levels, local, national, regional, and global, including the environment, including civil rights. The kind of development I'm looking at is not the one driven by economic reductionism, which looks at only economic development. What am I saying? I'm saying that within nations, interest about development evolve, it changes. When you have an interest that is seen to include the interest of others, that is an interest of inclusion. When you have an interest that is restrictive and it involves your own interest, that's an interest of exclusion. Let's take the case of Adam Smith's theory of a free market. That promoted mainly the interests of England, the industrial giant. Whereas the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage promoted the interest of several other countries. Number one, it says that two countries are able to trade if they specialize in areas where they have comparative advantage, where they are most efficient or least inefficient. In doing it, in giving this theory, Ricardo took notice of all other countries. In the theory, he used wine and cloth and used the example of Portugal as being more efficient than England. That's a very clever way of letting people see the interest of England within the interest of within their own interest. That theory advances and gives moral justification to colonialism. Because the colonies at that time in the Americas were the producers of raw materials for nation states of Europe. And most of the nation states of Europe are now colonizers. So it takes into view the interest of all colonizers. Interestingly, it also takes into view the interest of politicians, takes into view the interest of capitalists and socialists, because it also advances the interest of free market, which the capitalists see as within their purview. It's also seen as promoting labor theory of value that glamorizes the power of labor as generators of national wealth. So there is a meeting of minds with regard to the Ricardian theory, but it excludes the interests of colonies, which will be producing only raw materials. And in raw materials, you cannot, the producer of raw materials cannot make it, quote unquote, in the sense that raw materials never make it in the sense that diminishing returns always sets in. And with diminishing returns, you reach a stage that your input and your output will not be commensurate. You will be putting more input with less output per unit. Whereas if you are an industrialist, you will progress. You having what we call increasing returns to scale and market power. It's because of market power of manufacturers. That's why you have antitrust laws, for example. You don't need that for primary producers. Now, in that sense, the Ricardian theory, even though it has an image of exclusion, but it's still an image of exclusion, but it's evolving more in the direction of inclusion than Adam Smith's theory of free market, which promotes the interests of only industrial powers. So it's in that sense that we can see the concept of evolutionary self-interest as evolving in different directions of both inclusion and exclusion. Indeed, the American member of House of Representatives joked about the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage and calls it like other English products meant for export only at that time. And it is that same concept that drives the free market, free trade policies of today, which America is at the vanguard. So the interest of America has evolved. It wasn't when it was a colony. Adam Smith said that it will be a pity if America protected its industry. And at the same time, the same Adam Smith in somewhere in the later chapters of The Wealth of Nations said that only countries with domestic manufacturing industries can win in a war. And interestingly, the book was published in 1776 at the time that America was fighting the war of independence and declaring independence. So America protected its industry, won the war, and was opposed to the theory as at that time. Today, it's a different story. So that's what I mean by evolutionary self-interest. And based on that, I define the concept of evolutionary self-interest. Is that dynamic interest that's affected by knowledge, environment, culture, and beliefs, and hence can change or evolve over time and across geography in relation to development concerns. And development concerns are issues addressed in development policies like governance, income, distribution, poverty, civil rights, regional integration, the environment, etc. Image is a mental construct or perspective symbolism in people's minds about an event, activity, action, or a thing in relation to development concern. It is this image in relation to the types of self-interest that I've just mentioned that changes. The same development stakeholder can evolve can have self-interest that evolve in different directions depending on the situation. I've given the example of the US. The same is true of England with Adam Smith's theory and Ricardian's theory. The attractiveness of development policy is affected by this. when the image of the self-interest is perceived to be incorporating the self-interest of other development stakeholders, it's an image of inclusion. But when it is perceived otherwise, it's an image of exclusion. And the associated policy will be opposed. If it cannot be rejected, it will be accepted as a Hobson's choice, as the third world and Africa does. The HIPIC example, there are examples that we just accept because we have no other way to go. It will have accepted as a Hobson's choice, but it's going to affect the success or otherwise of that policy. It's going to affect the success or otherwise. It's like forcing a person to take poison, as it were. Now, my concept is that between the extremes of inclusion and inclusion, there's a broad spectrum of accommodation. And self-interest evolves over this. This can be measured using what I call the accommodation scale. Is there any unique explanation for Africa's behavior? To do this, I've tried to examine the history of the political history of Africa. One thing that I still want to talk about evolutionary self-interest is the setting up of the United Nations and the growth of EU. The setting up of the United Nations after the Second World War, the growth out of the League of Nations is affected by a cocktail of evolutionary images of evolutionary self-interest. It was started by a few nations, allied nations, 26 at the beginning. But it then extended to other nations. That is evolutionary interest of inclusion of one part. But the governance structure has both inclusion and exclusion. Take the case of the Security Council. It has images of inclusion and exclusion. The veto power nations, the way they do their job is an image of exclusion. But then there are 10 other nations elected every other year. That's an image of inclusion. The secretariat that employs people from so many parts of the world, ensuring that every regional part is employed. That's an image of inclusion. And I think that is the most, that's the greatest type of the development policy in the world. It starts with the United Nations. The way that they intervene in several areas, in refugees, taking hold of conflicts, that's a lot of inclusion. And that's a part that the third world benefits from. The same US that has inclusion is the same US that's promoting that type of thing. So that's what I mean by evolutionary interest. It evolves. It goes sometimes in direction of inclusion and withdraws, recedes. It expands in direction of inclusion. That's expansionary self-interest. When it recedes in the direction of exclusion, that's exclusionary self-interest. You take care of your own self-interest alone. And perhaps the EU is a good example of evolutionary self-interest. It was started with the founding of the European Coal and the European Coal and something Community in 1952. Only 6 nations were involved. England was invited. It didn't go. It didn't go. But at the time it was going to come in, President de Gaulle did really peppered England. It was at a cost to England to enter. The time it was invited, it had a different view because it was the leader at least in Europe. It thinks that it was the old thing. England didn't go. So later, the same European coal and steel community. That was it at 1952. With the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1952. The meeting was held in 51. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 52, and it became effective. It then extended to include all the others. It became the European Economic Community, and then became the European Union with signing of the Maastricht Treaty. When it continued to extend, and even took notice of the interest of developing nations, giving them preferential trade arrangement with the African, Pacific, and Caribbean countries. That is whatever we must call it. That's an evolution center of inclusion. The way they accepted in 2004 the 10 countries, about 8 of them from the communist nations that were not very well versed in the free market. They gave them some conditions that they even bent over backward, reviewed their voting arrangements. That is a kind of evolutionary self-interest of inclusion. They bent backward. They changed their rules, changed their voting arrangement. Before, every nation has had a veto power. Now they look qualified majority approach, where you would require 2/3 of the nations to say yes. That is evolutionary self-interest of inclusion. And only Europe has the highest kind of regional arrangement in the world. And all other nations copied them. NAFTA has done that, but it's not close to Europe. That's an arrangement that is an evolutionary self-interest of inclusion. I think it's proper that I should mention that. And for me, Africa needs to learn from that. There are so many regional groups in Africa that are working at cross purposes. Europe is a model, and the same Europe is a promoter of free market, free trade policy that I believe is driven by evolutionary self-interest, image of evolutionary self-interest of inclusion. That's how everybody can receive, expand, depending on what situation, depending on whatever what one wants to do. What does that tell us? It is possible to include other people. If you can do it in Europe, you can do it elsewhere. And that's the kind of message that I want to carry at the end of this. In trying to explain Africa's uniqueness, I try to look at Africa's political history. I look at the empires of Africa during the pre-colonial period. I found out that in the great empires of Ghana and Mali, the general ways that Africa has tried to develop was through wars, using the traditional concept of development as a zero-sum game. You lose, I gain. When a nation is prosperous, another nation will rise to drive them away. That creates cleavages, creates division. That's evolutionary interest of exclusion, because it's our nation first, and all of that can go to blazes. Even in the Empire of Mali, I found out that the Mansas derive their powers from the divine nature conferred on them by traditional religion. And the empire prospered in trade, in growth, commerce. Then with the conversion to Islam, Muslim Mansas still celebrated traditional festivals while still practicing Islam. I see these as an accommodation, an interest of inclusion, an image of self-interest of inclusion. We must recall the Malian Mansa Musa, who went to pilgrimage to Mecca with 500 slaves each carrying a bar of gold, which was reported favorably across Europe and in the Arab world by the Arab scholars of that era. Now, there came a time that Sonny Ali, a Songhai emperor, overthrew, displaced Mali. But Sonny Ali was not a Muslim. The Muslim Arabs, the Muslim Berber Arabs, portrayed Sonny Ali badly in their writing because they could not tolerate a non-Muslim controlling Timbuktu, for example, the greatest center of Islamic learning of his time. Now, in my view, that encouraged a Muslim general called Muhammad Ture. After the death of Sonny Ali, he usurped the throne of Sonny Ali from his heirs and established the Askia syndrome. I see this as unique. He is buying into what foreigners say is not good to advance his own self and group interest, and identify this as a cause of Africa's backwardness. I call it the Askia syndrome. It is very common today in Africa. It is the tendency to take advantage of a foreign view or action or seek foreign help to advance personal or group interests. The Askia syndrome. It is driven by image of evolutionary self-interest of exclusion, and is taken advantage of by foreigners, worsened and deepened by colonialists and the Cold War. It's at the base of what Jean-Francois Bayard, I hope my French sounds nice, Charlie, just pardon me. I hope I've not murdered French. Okay.
Bayard, that's perfect.
Bayard, okay. So, what Bayard called how Africans have participated in the processes that led to the insertion of their societies as dependent partner in the world economy, and in the last result, in the process of colonization. It promoted the slave trade. It's personal interest. You sell your brother just because somebody was going to give you a looking glass. They are scarce. It is behind the state of Africa, the state in Africa, politics of the belly. I have rephrased it to mean the state of Africa, politics of the belly. And it's very common. I will give a few examples. In Nigeria, it was exploited by the British. That division, the need to embrace a group or to promote a group, and that group that is promoted sees it as their birthright. The northern region of Nigeria is bigger than the two southern regions put together before independence and after independence. Britain set up a commission to determine creation of regions in Nigeria, and they were advised that the north should be broken and the south should be broken. They never broke it. The north today has a lot of political advantage because of that, and they exploited it and misexploited it. Indeed, a book by Olaniwa Ajayi, just published in 2009, contains evidences from records of the colonial archives regarding the fact that the British preferred the north to the south, and they used that divide and rule tactics, which we take advantage of when it favors us. For example, when they were holding a meeting in Nigeria in July 1953, this is one of the records of their meeting. I will try and cite the records of the minutes of their meeting. The next few weeks present us with our last chance of demonstrating to the North that we are not going to let them down. And if we miss that chance, it will never recur. We had better, while we have the opportunity, go all out to secure the loyalty and faith in us of the North, rather than to lose the North probably forever in an effort to placate an unreliable South at the behest of their, anyway, to some extent, unrepresentative spokesman. These were people elected by people, by the Southerners, even though it is by electoral college. But that was the election of that time. But the North was not called unrepresentative people. The South was unrepresentative. It was also...
And the North people were royals or people elected by electoral college?
They were also elected by electoral college. Electoral college. So they were losing that opportunity. They did a lot of that. But we have our faults, but we exploited it. It was done in the Congo Empire, where one Manikongo took over and increased among many rivals, increased conquest, slave trade, and slave trade with the Portuguese, who were their sole customers. Sometimes when they are fighting among themselves, like when one of them, Manikongo Alvaro I, sought their help to reinstate him, the Portuguese got closer to them. Eventually, they overthrew him, and with the firepower of an Afro-Portuguese army, Ascari syndrome, they defeated their own people. It was also done in Namibia when the Germans were there, the present-day Namibia, between the Nama and the Herero. They were caught because they were fighting for choice grazing land. One of them was formed an alliance with the German. The end was that they established a garrison in their area, the Herero. They established a garrison in their area. They seized their choice land. The Herero rebelled twice. They destroyed them. The next time, after they have annihilated the Herero, they went to the Nama and destroyed them. Where it appears to have happened, from my point of view, to have possibly to have etched a more lasting image is in Zululand, and it continues. The house of Chaka, the royal house of Chaka, they were overthrowing themselves, fighting among themselves, using the opportunity, having alliances. In fact, one of the successors of Mpande, Sheshawo, wanted the Boers to help him capture his half-brother, but and then hand over to him. They agreed, they handed over to him on the basis that he would not harm him. He gave them his choice land, reneged later, and that was used as an opportunity eventually to fight him, and for the British also, to the Anglo-Zulu War. In the end, they lost out. And the British then divided his empire into chiefdom, and that created further divisions, which etched a lasting legacy that we saw even during the anti-apartheid struggle and after apartheid. We know what happened with the violence after apartheid, among the Zulus. What is similar in northern Nigeria was the same thing repeated in Zululand. So that's what I call the Ascar syndrome. And it's still present now. For example, the politics of the belly that I've just mentioned. I will quote one example. There are so many other examples in this paper, like how they use divide and rule to divide the colonial, to set one group against the other, including traditional rulers and the elites, racing warrant ships where his word was law. And he then set him against his people, where there were no ships, leading to the Maji-Maji riots in Tanganyika and the kind of riot that we had in eastern Nigeria, where women the Aba riots of 1921, where they rose against the colonial power. Meanwhile, they have been set against each other. But there's one part of Africa that didn't happen. That was Botswana. It was said to be ethnically homogeneous. It never happened. They never used the so-called indirect rule in Botswana, and postulating that that's also behind why Botswana is different. And I'm also saying that it is not because of ethnic homogeneity that they did not do it in Botswana. The Akan in Ghana, they are ethnically homogeneous. They did that before they did the same thing of indirect rule. Before they have a loose federation where the power of the suzerain was controlled. If he misbehaved, he will be dethroned. But when the British came, they made him more powerful. We're putting a wedge between him and his people, Askia syndrome. So, in present-day Nigeria, let me give one example, which is the example of the politics of the belly. This is recent. The national lawmakers gave themselves a lot of salaries, earning about $100,000 from so many allowances, not just the salary, per month, because they are running the presidential system of government, which takes time. Meanwhile, they are not submitting themselves to the same discipline that the Americans submit themselves to. For example, we have not published our budget since 1994. Once you have a budget, how you spent it, it was done last under Abacha. They were asked to pass the Freedom of Information Bill. They have not passed it because that will allow us to ask questions. For more than 12 years now that we have been under civilian rule, they have not passed it. Yet there are so many primary schools that have no rules, and they are earning so much. Again, taking advantage of what happens in America to advance their self-interest. Now, since independence, how has Africa progressed? In the immediate post-independent era, the policies implemented are the mercantilist policy, the so-called registered dogma, where government is believed to be active both in service provision and in provision of goods and services because of lack of entrepreneurship and lack of capital. Africa did much better during that era. Even though that was an image of exclusion because interest of the merchants and government, but we still did better. Now, when we got into the problems of SAP and we started implementing free market policies due to the fact that Africa had a lot of debt problem, had problems of macroeconomic imbalances as a result of oil shocks of that era and many other things. We implemented that and we did worse. We now have, by 1997, what we have in terms of poverty is about 6 times worse as it was in 1970 when we were implementing mercantilist policies. What this says that it's not favorable to us. And when we then have revisions like getting properties right, getting governance right, it didn't improve the matter at all. And what am I saying? That free market, free trade policies, which says we have to open everything up, cut spending in everywhere, even where people are poor, even in education, higher education, saying that if you promote higher education, you are only helping the middle class. You are not helping the poor people, and that we should put money in primary education. In the end, they found out that you cannot promote entrepreneurship with primary education, and they asked us to go back. That didn't help either. Now, that shows us that things didn't work with free market, free trade policies. I want to make a point about foreign aid. There are 2 types of foreign aid that we have. the one that we got through the World Bank, which goes through government, the World Bank and IMF, and very huge, but the impact has not been very fruitful. There are some through NGOs and through some government agencies like the IDRC, International Development Research Center, Canada, that promoted the views of Africans. For example, the IDRC helped in the founding of the African Economic Research Association, purposely to train Africans to be able to negotiate with the World Bank and the IMF. And this has produced a lot of impact. It has led to the production of several, at least 3 central bank governors in Africa who went through that process. I'm one of the beneficiaries of that process. I know about 3 central bank governors in Africa. The one of Nigeria, the immediate past central bank governor of Nigeria, young person, is going to be 50. It's not too young in any case. He'll be 50 this year, the same age as Obama. The central bank governor of Kenya passed through that process, a researcher in that thing, and the central bank governor of Tanzania. Several deputy central bank governors. Maybe also try to train us in master's Master of Science in Economics, Master of Science in Agric Economics through the universities. They don't have to come here. And also what they call the collaborative PhD program in economics across Africa. And there are others in that area, very small but impactful. 2 types of foreign aids, but 2 distinct and contrasting results. This is very small but effective. Not every aid is dead aid. That small one, for me, is not dead aid. Not every aid is dead aid. How does Africa go about its development? There are 2 paradigms of development. The social-darwinism of free market, free trade hasn't helped us. There's the other one called emulation paradigm, which says that only nations at the same level of development can open up. And that, as the Americans told the British, the now advanced countries, we should be allowed to do as they did when they were advancing. They closed up. We should be allowed to do as they did, emulate how they advanced. They should not kick away the ladder. That is, but in doing this, in protecting, we should not follow the bad Latin American protectionist model. We should follow the good Asian protectionist model, where corruption is less, where entrepreneurship and innovation is promoted, where there is a lot more innovativeness. That is the way Africa should do. But in doing this, Africa has to identify the increasing resource sector. Using the Nigerian case study as an example, the food and beverage sector, the entertainment industry, and mobile telephony are important sectors. The interesting thing about the food and beverage sector is that in Nigeria, when the other sectors were closing down, it was producing at about 50% capacity because it was doing what people want. From there, we had the. I'm doing one to close to round up, but I will try and summarize. The issue here is that it helps to link with other sectors. We have a fast food industry different from all of Africa, uniquely African. And this has helped to produce food for exports. We have a thriving diaspora that is doing that. And even our so-called partying culture, it has helped a lot in doing this. And our partying culture, spending on it that the Western countries think is wasteful. I don't think it's wasteful because it promotes jobs. Spending on the partying culture is not too dissimilar to spending on Halloween. It's not too dissimilar to spending on Thanksgiving. is not too dissimilar to spending on sports, because it generates and it links. More importantly, we in Nigeria are so.
What do you call it? A party culture?
Partying culture.
Partying culture.
Yes, the celebration of rites of passage.
Okay.
A lot of partying culture. We have death, marriages, and marriages and graduation, with things that we would not have even consumed at all.
Well, Christmas is the big example here, right? That's the biggest consumer time of the year.
Yes, I don't want to mention Christmas because that has a spiritual significance. I've done that advisedly. We do that too. But the partying culture, why I mentioned Halloween, you gauge economic performance at that period, and also Thanksgiving, that the consumers did not buy this year as they did last year. And in Yoruba language, somebody calls Halloween Ọdún àwọn àjẹ́. That is the festival of witches. That's what it looks like to me. Yet you promote spending on it. So we are spending. It's not different. One of the areas I want us to look at is that our partying culture has promoted what we call mobile toilets. In our own type of public health is so terrible. This mobile toilet now, they have built toilets around so many places that people just go to pay as little as, although it's high in Nigeria, it's not too high, about 10 cents in every bus stop, motor park, where government has failed. That has replaced it. What which could have been, if there was not the production of juices from Nigerian products would have failed. It is the partying culture that sustained it. So many other things like rearing of bushmeat, rearing of snails, rearing of fisheries, and all whatnot. The partying culture has sustained it. People don't have enough money to buy, for example, juice for breakfast table, but they are able to purchase it because of the social support during parties, and that has kept that industry flourish, being able to send things abroad. For me, that is good. Entertainment industry, we have things that are progressing there. I want to talk about one area that I love. In Yoruba language, it's a language that is tonal. So porn is very rich. It's rich in porn. Like one ọmọ ìyá kì í yà, ọmọ bàbá ní bá, ìyá yà, bàbá bá. What it's saying is that the maternal siblings cannot be set against each other, whereas paternal siblings behave in a way that they try to set traps for each other. It's showing us that unity between maternal siblings than paternal siblings. But through the entertainment industry now is so developing that Yoruba is becoming a rhyming language. It wasn't there before, and that's rich. Those are areas that we are developing, and our entertainment industry is booming. This one from Gboro. Ẹ má kò yàn mí kéré mo ti gboro, mi kì í ṣe kí à ń sọ̀rọ̀, tó bá lọ kòtò lọ dẹmọ bí kòkòrò, tó bá pàdé mi ní gboro, torí kòrókòró, ó máa ṣòro ṣòro. Don't underrate me. I'm beyond sway. I talk not in a careless way. As the crazy ones showing off in the pit, if we meet downtown for eyeball to eyeball gaze, to be one tough grace. What is establishing is competitive presence in the musical landscape. I am here now. I am competitive. If you want to meet me in competition, that's the eyeball to eyeball grace. Let's meet at where we will celebrate downtown. We will face each other, eyeball to eyeball. You can see the rhymes there. It's easy. You don't have to be a Yoruba speaker to see rhymes there. They were never present. For me, there are so many of them, so many genres of that. It leads to creativity. It leads to language development. To me, development is holistic. That's one of the areas. Again, another area is in our film industry. This so-called Nollywood industry is developing. It has a thriving across all of Africa and across the diaspora, and it's developing. Again, we also have the telephone industry. We have the actual K, which we do. The modern telephone industry is an area that we can use as our own increasing return sector. Besides, what can we do for our future image? Thank God for Mandela. Mandela came out of prison, started a rainbow nation. Others, like Mugabe, were fighting the others. And he gave an example of an evolutionary self-interest of inclusion. All creeds, all races. And that happened a lot. It promoted the acceptability of South Africa, their popularity. It attracted so many people wanting to go there, invest there. That is because of his image of inclusion. Besides, he stepped down after first term, showing that in Africa, it's not all Africans that must die as life president. And because of that, he becomes not just a moral authority in Africa, he has become a global moral authority. And that has affected Africa. Indeed, it affected our getting the World Cup and the kind of thing that is attracted to South Africa. South Africa has always been the largest economy in Africa, but is still ahead of all the other. And for me, it's showing that Africa can rise from the ruins of the dark continent to be a rising continent. Secondly, where the continental body has failed to control governance, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation has come evaluating leadership in Africa. It has only been awarded twice. 2009, 2010, they didn't award it because they didn't find anybody worthy of taking it. That shows that African leaders have to sit up. There are people watching them. If they think that they can manipulate their media to lie to us, in fact, Nigeria is number 44 in 2010. Ghana is number 7. There are also other role models. Mo Ibrahim Foundation awarded the first to Chisano of Mozambique for what he did after the war and ensuring that the nation become one, evolutionary self-interest of inclusion, not exclusion. And in Botswana, the only country that was not divided using divide and rule tactics, the so-called indirect rule of the British. Finally, Ghana is there. For me, Ghana is carrying forth the image of evolutionary self-interest of inclusion that Kwame Nkrumah has always had. He was misinterpreted, he was misunderstood. The Cold War was used to overthrow him when he was away. He had his faults, and every leader has their fault. But he is a pan-Africanist to the core. And he was opposed a lot by Western writers and Western scholars. Ghana is there. Those are the examples of rising stars. Those are things that we have to compare ourselves with. We have to refer Africans to. That they have to look at this. They were not there before. Such countries were not there before. You have people like Ofoboyen, sustained by Cold War, Yadema, sustained by Cold War, Mobutu Sese Seko, sustained by Cold War, and Siad Barre, that left a stateless Somalia, sustained by Cold War. Hope is rising in Africa. What do we have to do? Africa has to implement the evolution paradigm. Each country has to identify its sector, increasing sector, probably in agriculture, agro-allied industry, food industry, poverty reduction, equity, participation in governance. Each country has to do that, and they have to de-emphasize their scarce syndrome from the leadership by involving the entire geography in each country in whatever we do, by showing that if the leadership has the interest of all the others at heart, the followership will easily follow. The EU needs to be reorganized in a way that will look at the kind of thing that EU has done, promoting evolutionary services of inclusion, and we have to look for a way of negotiating with our creditors to allow us to do as they did. The time to do it is now, because it is the right time. The time is always right to do what is right. Thank you.
So thank you. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I think it's a very good presentation, especially that somebody like you is a youth in Africa and who will take on from your generations here. You talked about the image of inclusion, and I want to relate it to a problem of Africa, which is in the area of democracy. African countries have been unable to consolidate their democracy, and political scientists have argued that one of the ways of promoting democracy in Africa is through constitutional democracy. And a part of it is the unity government that African countries are now engaging on. And the example of Mugabe in Zimbabwe, power sharing agreements, trying to introduce the opposition into its own leadership system. But do you see that as part of the image of inclusion? And if you do see that as an image of inclusion, do you really see that image of inclusion working for Africa in terms of consolidating and democracy? That is my first question. And the second one is about the issue of the entertainment industry that you cited. I think that there is a divided view in the academy about seeing that pattern of language as development, or seeing it as creativity that should develop African languages. The paper written by a professor from Obafemi University, Professor Yemi Adedoyin, sees it as linguistic corruption, and that it is related to our debased value system in Africa. And when I was younger, if I use the word that we use in music, if I say demo, or if I say collabo is from collaboration, and collabo is used to mean sexual intercourse. It's used by minors to disguise the act of sexual intercourse. When I was younger, my mother would give me a knock on the head. So this is to say that the idea of seeing this as development is only confined to the academy. People in Nigeria don't necessarily see it as development. So what is your view about that?
I will start from the last one. People are always conservative, but only when it comes to culture. For me, Yoruba has to borrow to advance. We are not a technical language. If you want to use Yoruba for science, we have to expand our alphabet, for example. It has no X. It has no C of English. It has S that we pronounce as C. Now, if you want to, don't forget that knowledge is universal. Mathematics is universal. They contest. If you want to use all those, we have to be able to learn that. French, learn that later. French was a pure language, and they will write longish things to say what English will say in a few words. I will have wished that Charlie Pure was here to controvert me. because he may have a different view. Now, but French is now putting weekend, so many things, so many English words are now in French. What is called linguistic corruption, that's his view. And we will meet at our meeting, we will argue about it. That, for me, is richness. Collabo, the one that you use, can have another meaning as collaboration. The same word that is collabo to mean they are cohabiting. I can borrow it to mean collaboration. And we start using collabo and we spend it as ki or li a b o, collabo, collaboration. And the language grows so that it becomes more and more modern. And from there you can advance it. You know, in fact, one of the things I've been talking about as because of my background was mathematics, is that we don't have cardinality in Yoruba. We also only have ordinality. If we are going to talk about the Bible, chapter 1, the chapter of the Bible, you will say Ori Kini. Kini is ordinal. For me, I have been collaborating with people that will say Orioko. Once we start saying it, it becomes that part of that's cardinality, not ordinality. Orieji. I did that in my church one day. And I said, so. They were laughing. But I was using it to test the waters. And I had my view. And I argued when they said, this is the reason why I'm using it.
Well, everyone learns to count.
Yes.
Cardinally, right?
Yes. But when it comes to talking, Ani Orikini, the first chapter. Whereas we want to talk about chapter 1. That's ordinality. Cardinality is so important. So if you want to talk about X1 in Yoruba, what will you say? You will say X Okon, X AG, X Eta, rather than X Kini, X KG. And that is useful for the language. He may call it linguistic corruption. It is his view. He's entitled to do it. We will and you meet at the arena and we will argue. I will argue about the economic and the developmental value of my view. We argue about his own. He's a purist. But Yoruba is not a technical language. If it wants to be a technical language of science, it has to do what other people do in science. And that's the kind of thing that I'm saying. When they were laughing at them, I wasn't laughing at them at all. I saw it as growth. And I went, and there are so many of it. And I have not been working in this area before, but thank God and thank Randy for inviting me here. This is something I will start writing upon and be writing upon. When you have so many of it, maybe the views will hold.
So, any other? We lost the questioner midway through the question.
Okay.
That's a sign of a filibuster.
The unity government. The unity government you're talking about. You see, it's not just power sharing. It's not just. It goes beyond power sharing. If you say proportional representation now, then I buy that. It's not a winner takes all. It's a win-win situation. What I'm asking for is a win-win situation. There are things I didn't mention. If we allow us to do it, all those aids they give us and we steal, we won't need them. It will be useful somewhere else. They will lose some, but we will also gain some. We will lose everything. So we'll be coming back to beg. If you say unity, if you say proportional representation, then I buy it. But just because you bring somebody in like Mugabe that was forced to accept Shangarai, Mugabe is an exclusionist to the core. And he will be trying to say these Western people are trying to oppress me. Doesn't he see a person like Mandela? So there is a reference point now for Africa to see. Mandela is there. Evolutionary self-interest of inclusion. For me, he's the first person that did that. Others will be looking for vengeance to retaliate. He didn't do it. And South Africa and Africa, we are.
Randy?
Well, thank you. First, I'm going to try to summarize what I feel that I heard, and you tell me if I've understood correctly. Then I have a question about Mandela and other models of his type. I understand you to be saying that any given nation or population evolves over time with respect to its understanding of its self-interest, and therefore with respect to what it regards as the ideal development strategies. And that every sense of self-interest or development strategy varies along at least one index. Some are more inclusionary of the interests of larger populations, and some are more exclusionary of the interests of larger populations. And it's relatively normal in the cases that you brought up for people to see their interests being in common with people who are relatively like themselves in level of development, for example. You also observed what you regard as a uniquely African pathology, and that is the strategy of gaining personal or small group power within Africa by borrowing foreign ideas and allying with people who are more different in order to take advantage of people who are more similar. I think you added that strategically, it has been necessary in the history of every developed country, just as it will be in the history of every developing country, to make judicious choices with respect to how inclusive your strategy of development is going to be at any given historical moment, and how exclusive. There is always room for some exclusion insofar as the development of currently underdeveloped nations will require the protection of markets and the creation of links within a local market rather than depending on exterior links. Have I understood you correctly so far?
You gave a very good interpretation of what I'm saying, even beyond my thinking.
Oh, okay.
But it looks good to me.
Okay.
That if you can interpret it in that way, then I'm communicating.
Yes. Okay. Now, with respect to, you've noticed this culture of injudicious balances in Africa, the Askia syndrome, and you've noticed a number of role models for a more judicious balance. But most of your descriptions of these more judicious actors have emphasized their inclusiveness. For example, Mandela's inclusiveness of, I guess, multiple ethnic groups and letting other people become president and that sort of thing. I wonder if one must think also about the consequences in South Africa, whereby such an inclusiveness has still left Black people in their vast majority extremely poor and desperate. Is there room in your ultimate model for not only this level of generosity of Mandela's inclusiveness, but for the possibility that there are some situations inherited from the colonial period when, say, people who are very unlike the majority population own everything, own all of the arable land or all of the urban real estate? I mean, is there any moment where exclusivism has to enter the vocabulary of the judicious balance that you think is ideal in any given nation at any given moment in its history? Are you with me?
I am. It allows for that. In that, indeed, that's what it preaches. That those who have should be willing to give, so that the others who don't have will have. In fact, the accommodation scale that I have goes between 0 and 10. 0 is perfect exclusion. 10 is perfect inclusion. Within that, there is a spectrum of accommodation. 5 is like balance. I can stay with it. I am indifferent. I can live with it. That's midpoint. That's where Obama is trying to go now. About 5. You can go to the left where you are going in the direction of exclusion. You can go to the right where you are going to in the direction of inclusion. And I'm postulating that at the point 80%, 80% 8 inclusion, 2 exclusion, 80-20 rule, Pareto point. That is a point of optimality. If you can have that balance, that is the beginning of what I think is the golden age of that policy. I was looking at people voting and talking about past presidents that were popular. Only JFK was above 80, and I chuckled. He had a golden era for America. They are romanticizing him, in my point of view. At the point 2080, that is the obvious point. Point 2080, 20 inclusion, exclusion, 20 inclusion, 80 exclusion.
So if you don't mind a very challenging follow-up.
Yes.
Is there any room in your heart to acknowledge Mugabe as a model, in the sense that he has, through a certain dastardly form of exclusionism, also achieved land redistribution that South Africa has not achieved?
The case of South Africa, I would prefer the case of Africa to do it gradually in a way that will not cause chaos. He did it in a way that caused chaos, and he didn't pay Africa. He didn't pay, and he refused to leave. He was not listening. We can still negotiate. The Sisi Road had his problem. Mugabe also has his own problem. He did a lot to fight for his people, but he misused it. He wasted the effort, in my view. I have my heart to say he's a colonial fighter. That's the end of it all. When he did it, what did he do with it? He personalized it. What we are saying that Cold War did to Africa, he's doing it to his country.
Can I ask a question, perhaps?
Yes, please.
I wonder, Mugabe, for all of his current bad press, of course, in the 1980s was being lauded for precisely the same things that Mandela, that you were lauding Mandela for. He did not institute a land reform. He allowed the white settlers to remain on their land. He made alliances effectively with them. So you identify this as Skia syndrome. But I wonder what this actually does for African economic development. I wonder why it is that somebody who's more exclusionary, or somebody who's if bad governance or good governance, I don't know if those are terms that make any sense to you. But I'm trying to find in your talk some way that I can understand how this connects to parts of Africa or other parts of the world where economic development, or if we might prefer social development, I don't know what we want to be measuring or thinking about as development, but what is the relationship between this kind of exclusionary or inclusive politics, which is what you're talking about?
Not just politics, including development, including human rights, including things about poverty. I'm talking about development holistically. Okay. But I'm using the political history to trace that.
So there's an identification, you're making a direct correlation between successful development outcomes,
yes,
and the relative inclusiveness or holisticness,
yes,
of the strategies that are employed
yes.
But empirically, does that actually work on the ground? Nyerere's Tanzania would appear to have met many of your inclusive objectives in its 1960s and 70s projects for really transforming Tanzania, and it didn't work.
It worked to some extent. All of those things that happened were because of the oil shocks. All the dismantling of what happened in the first 2 decades of our post-independence was because of the free trade, free market policies. Everything that we have became dismantled.
But that's actually kind of important, because you presented us with an argument that policy set in Africa by African leaders, right, or African institutions, political institutions, is extremely important in the kinds of outcomes we're going to get.
Yes.
As I understand the kinds of development outcomes that have occurred in Africa, especially from the 1980s. This is when I was studying Africa first as an undergraduate and studying political economy and the African crisis and all this. It had little to do with it had little to do with the particular political strategies of a particular regime, the inclusiveness or exclusiveness of it. Instead, it had everything to do with what you just said, the oil shocks, the kind of international environment that forced certain kinds of policies onto African countries. I mean, I'm not sure that those two things.
In fact, that's my argument. The kind of policies that we implemented were not inclusive. It was promoting the interest of our creditors and remove our own interests. We are not at the same level. How can we be hewers of woods and drawers of water? Once we are producing primary products, there is no way we can make it because it is always diminishing returns. Until we start producing manufacturers, we will not make it. That's my argument. It's not just, you see, I don't want to blame the Western. We have our own problems. That's why I identify as scar syndrome. If we have emulation paradigm, if you want to, and the domestic environment is hostile, it won't work. So that's why I've identified what is unique in us that's not making us to work. You give us money, we steal the money. That's because of Askia syndrome.
Well, you'd be happy to know, or if anybody doesn't know, that Askia Muhammad died deposed and stuck on an island in the Niger River.
Yes,
he had an unhappy end at least.
Because that's the Askia. He has reaped what he's told.
Exactly. Well, so we can hope perhaps that there's a moral outcome to this.
Yes, because he has reaped what he's told. I didn't even know that because I'm not a historian. I can't. I'm doing that. What I'm doing here, I'm doing it for the first time. Let me confess to you. I didn't even know that history is interpreted until I got here. I just thought that. Let me give you a joke. When we were reading science, we were joking about those who are reading history that they just read about one king reigned and died. Obaku, Obaje. That's all they did. I was stupid because I didn't know. Now I know better. It's here that I've discovered, I think I've rediscovered myself. I just looked at it and said, why is this? Why did you do this? And I then called it Askia syndrome. And let's see what it talks about the debate. We just started the debate. It's not perfect. I've just thrown something up and let's see what happens. So what I've tried to do, sir, ma'am, is that what external influence is preventing us to develop? What internal influence do we need to change to develop? It has to be reciprocity. So it should be reciprocal. We shouldn't be blaming people when we ourselves are thieves. It's true as Askia syndrome that they just give us money, we don't use it, we steal it.
And my questions are of course meant in your debate. Your paper sparked the debate, the questions that I posed in the same spirit. Does anybody have any other questions?
Well, I might add, as a tag on to what you're saying about Tanzania, that you have interpreted development in a way that goes beyond numerical indices.
Yes.
In such a way that invites us to note that Tanzania has, more than any other sub-Saharan African country, solved the plague of sub-Saharan Africa, and that is so-called tribalism. I mean, through their inclusivism. Nobody talks about themselves as I'm of this tribe as opposed to that tribe.
Thank you very much. You have given me another interpretation. I will remember that.
And that I'm sure that is going to save them a lot of economic stress.
Yes. That's another. And one of the things that I'm trying to correct, economics are extremely arrogant. They look at development as economic. That's not so. That's not so. I'm talking about this because I came from a different background to become an economist. So I'm able to see differently. They will be interpreting it, but I'm not ashamed to use history to interpret. They will say, what has it done? But for me, it's rich. Since I've not used mathematics, luckily I started with mathematics. They won't say I don't know mathematics. So, but these are things that mathematics cannot explain.
When you write your book, you should probably throw in a little mathematics.
Oh, but there's a mathematics there. Yeah. There's mathematics there. I have a theory that I've not mentioned here, and I have see how I defined it as an image of They function from the set of development stakeholders to over development concerns to the image space, and that's why how I'm going to measure the image is a bounded continuous image which I've chosen to be between 0 and 10 for convenience. But that's not in the body of the book. It's going to be in the appendix because I'm writing for everybody, not just economists, because I'm looking at development broadly. When I'm talking about language development, that's not economics, but it yields a lot of economics, a lot of money. Here, we have seen people watching Nigerian movies so much because we have a thriving diaspora population, and they're buying a lot of these kind of things. So those are the kind of things that I hope I start a good debate.
Catherine? We have another question. Go ahead.
I'm struggling a little bit with what feels like a paradox in this conversation, in this debate, in that you present this very dynamic, global kind of set of ideas about development and economic and political change, etc., based around relationships, global relationships, colonialism, apartheid, American, British colonialism, etc. And yet it feels very isolated when you then come down to the sort of idea of the Asperger syndrome, or the idea of the solution, or the sort of models that we want to look at, like Mandela, as if each of or the EU, each of those processes seem to happen in this, even though you talk about them as like global in relation to others, they seem to happen in this very isolated way. The European nations decide, out of whatever their image of self-interest is, the union is a good idea. Africa, various Africans collude with colonial forces in terms of their self-interest, as if those things happen completely isolated, even though they are always in relationship to these other processes. So that's because even Mandela's, and I agree with Randy, sort of troubling kind of choice to protect individual rights and private property at the expense of pro-South Africans. That didn't happen just because Mandela was a good guy or because the ANC at the time had a sort of ideas of inclusion. It happened in relationship to global pressures and global interests. And so I'm sort of confused about, like, on one hand, it begins global, but then it's sort of in relationship to sort of various sort of different groups. But then it becomes just about these very sort of isolated cultural or sort of social or political processes. And so